All right, so welcome everybody. I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar, Advocacy as a Federal Employee, presented by Dr. Kathleen McNamara. This webinar is a collaboration between Division 18's Veterans Affairs section and the Association of VA Psychologist Leaders, and part of our Advocacy webinar series. I'm Tiffany Fennell, chair of the VA section of Division 18, and I'm also a psychologist at the VA Puget Sound Healthcare System. Before we get started, I'd like to take a brief moment to mention that Division 18, Psychologists in Public Service, has been the home for VA psychologists and other public service psychologists in APA since 1946. And the Association of VA Psychologist Leaders, or AVAPAL as you may know them, is a professional organization outside of APA for psychologists in the VA. So these two organizations have a long and rich legacy of advocating for VA psychologists and the veterans we serve. For more information about these organizations, please check out the Notes and Files pods, where you can find links to our websites and brochures. And one last note before introduction, all questions can be entered into the chat box, and they'll be answered towards the end of the webinar today. And if there are any technical difficulties, also just enter that into the chat box and I'll attend to you as quickly as possible. So now for introduction. Dr. Kathleen McNamara is a board-certified clinical psychologist who led a successful and influential career in the VA for 3 decades, advocating for veterans and VA psychologists in her many important roles as clinician, educator, administrator, as well as multiple leadership roles in professional organizations such as APA, AVAPAL, and the National Academies of Practice. She's received many awards and honors recognizing her contributions, including the APA Presidential Citation in 2017 for aiding veterans, their families, and people of Hawaii. She's also a fellow of Division 18 in addition to 4 other divisions. And since retiring from the VA in 2017, she's continued to serve veterans in her independent practice in Hawaii, as well as continued state and federal level advocacy. So it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Kathy McNamara.
Thank you very much, Tiffany. And I want to thank both Division 18, and I know that Monica is on our list of attendees this morning too. So thank you, Monica Roy, for being present too, and also obviously for AVAPL. So again, as you see the title, Advocacy as a Federal Employee, so there will be a distinction in a way between when you are a federal employee and what does it mean when you are not a federal employee. So what I want to go over first is the Hatch Act, because I think many times advocacy gets equated within our VA system with political kinds of things. So I kind of wanted to get that part out of the way and then go back and really talk much more generally and generically about advocacy. So, and again, by way of introduction, I think, all of you who are attending would have received a flyer that Tiffany sent out, but I want to be sure I go over the learning objectives. And then at the end, as Tiffany said, please hold your comments or enter them in the chat box. And then at the end, we'll talk about any questions that still remain and also the comments that you might have. But I do want to make sure that I meet what the learning objectives are, because I also know, and I want to thank Tiffany very much for being able to secure CE, continuing education credits, for these kinds of webinars. So again, the learning objectives. The first one being that you all as attendees will be informed about the extent to which federal employees may engage in advocacy, educational activity, and/or political activity when not on duty or in the workplace, including when using social media, with particular reference to the Hatch Act. So that's the first learning objective. The second, that you all as attendees would develop the clear understanding that there are parallels between advocacy, which can occur right there within your own VA system, and you can be very active advocates in that system, and the elements of advocacy that apply when it's external to the VA. I think most people would recognize things with regard to advocacy for certain pieces of legislation, particularly lately with things like the Choice Act and now the Mission Act. So again, to develop that clear understanding of that parallel, including what the elements are that are related to the process and the outcome of advocacy. And then the third learning objective will be the discussion providing information and strategies which can serve as a foundation for those who are truly interested in becoming effective advocates. And I do hope that many of you will want to be very proactive in terms of advocacy on behalf of our discipline of psychology, on behalf of our veterans, and on behalf of the things that are most important and of meaning to you individually. And so toward the end, we'll really be talking much more about what does that mean? How can you be an effective advocate? All right, so again, defining advocacy, I mean, if we literally went to Webster's to define advocacy, it's a very brief definition, which basically says that it's the act of pleading for, supporting, or recommending. But then there's also a list of many, many synonyms that go along with advocacy. And I think over the course of this discussion, I think maybe some of those will be much more evident. So the synonyms including things like champion, defending, promoting, backing, promulgating, advancing, justifying, upholding. So many, many ways that advocacy can be interpreted. So again, because I think many times VA employees in particular can be intimidated into saying, somebody telling you, you can't do that, you can't advocate because of the Hatch Act. So I want to be sure that I make that distinction again, that advocacy is much more than political activity. But for that part of it, which is political, I want to go over the Hatch Act for you. So again, kind of the definition of the Hatch Act. And for any questions that you have, the best source, obviously, is to go to the Office of the Special Counsel. So that's the www.osc.gov, and you'll find all sorts of ins and outs about the Hatch Act. But I want to go over the very basic premises of the Hatch Act. So it was designed to limit certain political activities of federal employees, to ensure that federal programs are administered in a nonpartisan fashion, to protect federal employees from political coercion in the workplace, and to ensure that federal employees are advanced based on merit and not based on political affiliation. So again, those were the premises that really underlie the Hatch Act. Now, again, because I think most of the time the reference to the Hatch Act in your employment becomes what you cannot do. So I wanted to start with basically what you can do. And again, the reference here, if you want to look in more detail, a lot of these things, is the Hatch Act at osc.gov. So first of all, I think there have been a number of times when people think, oh, because I'm a federal employee, I'm now restricted, my First Amendment rights, I can't speak out the way I want to. And that's not at all the case. So the courts, actually, it has gone to court, and the courts have actually decided that the Hatch Act is not an unconstitutional infringement on First Amendment rights to freedom of speech. And the Office of the Special Counsel in a 2005 presentation says employees retain the right to speak out on political subjects and candidates. And we'll get into more detail on that in just a little bit. But I did want to go over the next part, which was there were reform amendments to the Hatch Act in 1993 to try to make some things clearer about the can and cannot do's of federal employees. So the reform amendments made it very clear that federal employees may take an active part in partisan, so that would be, your basic political parties, for example, political management and partisan political campaigns. Now, we'll get into it in a little bit that you still may not seek public office in a partisan election, but that again doesn't preclude you from trying to seek office in nonpartisan positions. So the second part of the reform amendments is that while off duty, so again, not in your workplace, not during work hours, you may work on partisan campaigns for candidates. And again, earlier on, there were definite restrictions or implied restrictions, which said things like, you can't go out and, in Hawaii, one of the big things is sign waving. People just line up on the streets with signs for their candidates. As a federal employee, you can do those kinds of things, just not on your work time. So let me go on again. You can do certain things and clearly do these with only the caveats that you may not be on duty. So you can do it if you're off duty, and if you're not in your workplace, and if you're not in a government vehicle. And further, if you're in some sort of official uniform, official insignia, you have your badge on, then again, you cannot do these things that are quite permissible for any federal employee to do. So I have provided in that slide a list of the things, to be very specific, that you can join, be active, hold office in partisan groups, that you can sign and circulate nominating petitions, that you can attend and be active at political rallies and meetings. You can campaign for or against candidates in partisan elections. You may make campaign speeches for candidates in partisan elections. You can express your opinions about political issues. You may be a candidate in a nonpartisan election. So that could be things like, again, maybe if your school board is an elected position, your community association, your city or county council. Even I know here in Maui, the mayor's position is not a partisan election. So there are a number of elections where you could actually hold public office as long as it is a nonpartisan election. Many times with the Hatch Act, some additional kinds of questions have come up. And so there's a section on frequently asked questions, and I just want to go over a few of those because I think it's pretty telling. So there are things like, what if you have a bumper sticker on your car? Can you park your car with that bumper sticker in the government parking lot? Yes, you may do that. Can you personally contribute money to the campaign of a partisan candidate or political candidate or organization? Yes, you can contribute money. Can you organize a fundraiser? And yes, you can do that, but you cannot personally solicit or accept or in any way be directly involved with receiving contributions, unless that happens to be for your nonpartisan election. You can then solicit funds, but if it's for another candidate, you can organize the fundraiser. You just can't solicit the money yourself or cannot take the money yourself. And again, those sorts of things do happen. For those of you who are involved in any way with APA related things with regard to the way that APA tries to do fundraisers for certain candidates, for certain congressional people, you might get a request that says, we need to raise money for this $1,000 a plate dinner for this particular candidate. Well, before I was a federal employee, what I would do is send a letter out and request that maybe 9 or 10 of my friends would contribute $100. Easier to contribute $100 than 1,000. So I would be soliciting funds on behalf of that congressional candidate. I can no longer do that when I was a federal employee. So again, organizing fundraiser, yes. Soliciting funds for a particular candidate, no, unless it's you yourself. Can you assist in voter registration drives? I think, in the current political climate, that's a question that could very easily come up. Absolutely, you can participate in voter registration drives. Can you write letters to the editor about either candidates or about political issues? And again, yes, you can. You can write letters. You can post comments. When we get to social media, you can see where you can post comments. You can endorse a political candidate in a letter to the editor or on a social media platform. So there are many things that you can do, and that again, when people who really don't understand the implications of the Hatch Act can attempt to be much more intimidating for what you can and cannot do as a federal employee. So if you have questions about whether you can do, again, your own legal counsel in your facility would be a good avenue to start. Or if you wanted to just go directly, the Office of the Special Counsel would be happy, I'm sure, to answer your questions if they haven't already answered it in some format on their website. Now, what you cannot do is, first of all, you may not be a candidate in a partisan election. So again, the nonpartisan, fine. Partisan, no, you cannot be a candidate and be a federal employee. And very clearly, I think the next one makes just very good common sense, is that you cannot invite your subordinates to political events or suggest that they engage in some kind of political activity. If you go back to the origins of the Hatch Act, that it was to be sure that people get promoted based on merit and not on some kind of political affiliation. It makes obvious sense that if you are a supervisor for someone or in some way have some kind of direct or indirect power over somebody as a subordinate, then you don't discuss with them attending political events or engaging in political activity. Again, going back to that, you may not solicit, accept, or receive political contributions. And again, that means, as I mentioned in my example about inviting others to participate in fundraising. So in this case, let's say that again, if you have an organization like an employees organization within your VA, so if you and another person are both members of that same employee organization, and the solicitation is for the organization's political action committee, and the person is not a subordinate, and you're not on duty or in the workplace, then you could participate in that kind of soliciting for political contributions. So some real fine nuance there in terms of how you're going to define yourself in that particular situation. And clearly, bottom line is always, just as in general in the VA, you never use VA resources for any personal activity or interest. So here, again, you're not going to be doing any of this if you're on duty or if you're in the workplace. Now, I think one of the questions that also may come up pretty frequently is you cannot wear, display, or distribute partisan material in the workplace or while on duty. So, you're not to be wearing somebody's campaign button while you're coming in and out of the VA building. You cannot be wearing their T-shirt. Let's say you just came from, you were out doing some kind of fundraising sort of thing, and you still have the T-shirt on. You cannot do that. You can't wear that in the workplace area. Again, earlier I said that you may personally make political contributions, and that's true, but you can't do that while you're on duty or in the workplace. So you can't be, giving a check, writing a check and giving a check to somebody who wants to raise funds for a political candidate, again, partisan political candidate, while you're sitting at your desk. We'll get in again in more detail to things about social media, but you may not use email or social media for political activity at your workplace or on duty hours. That doesn't mean that you're not going to be able to use that, and we'll get into that about how does social media play into this. So again, the do's and don'ts of social media. So there's a very specific definition of political activity by the Office of Special Counsel with regard to the social media context. And the definition of political activity in social media context is sharing, liking, or retweeting a post from a partisan group or candidate for partisan office, or posting and or tweeting a comment about a partisan group or candidate for partisan office. So that's the definition. Now, this is not into do's and don'ts yet. That's just the definition. Now, with regard to the do's and don'ts, you may use social media to engage in political activity. And so, political activity, any activity directed at the success or failure of a partisan political party or partisan political group, except when on duty or in the workplace. So, everything that was in that first point on the slide about sharing, liking, retweeting, or tweeting, etc., you may do all of those things by social media, but not while on duty and not while in the workplace. You may include your official title or position on a social media profile. Now, when you're sending out emails or in any way sending something out on social media platform, you are not going to list your title there because it would imply that somehow there is an official aspect to this. But you can put it into your profile. You may not use social media to solicit political contributions at any time. You may not use social media account in your official capacity to engage in political activity at any time. So that's the part about, in your official capacity. You cannot use your title if you're putting out something with regard to the definition of political activity. While on duty or in the workplace, you may not like or follow the social media page of a candidate for partisan office or a partisan group. So again, basically making that distinction always about whether you're on duty time or whether you're in the workplace or in a government vehicle versus you're a private citizen. So those are the do's and don'ts of social media. And those are the do's and don'ts earlier about what the Hatch Act intends to do. So, if people have questions about that, again, you can either, type them and we'll get back to them later or hold on to them. And, there is going to be a time toward the end when we can do questions and answers that would be just very specific to either the Hatch Act in general or to social media. So now I want to go on to the more generic aspects, the development of an advocate. And when we come back later to the parallels between being an advocate in a more general sense, like working, let's say, with APA government relations people on pieces of legislation, or even working with AVAPL. So again, there's a distinction in that AVAPL, well, there used to be a distinction. APA has now changed kind of how it defines itself with regard to engaging in advocacy and other kinds of, quote, lobbying kinds of activity. But at the moment, I'm just talking about development of an advocate, and we can come back later and talk about how do you be an advocate in your own VA system. So the development of an advocate, just to ask yourself, do you believe in what you're advocating for? Are you passionate about it? If you are passionate, can you control your emotion about it and really remain factual in terms of advocating for a position or for an outcome? Clearly, what is your level of knowledge about the issue? Without a doubt, if you're going to be at all involved in advocating in the sense of working with with APA or with AVAPL or even Division 18 people on the Hill, if you're going to be at all involved in talking with people who are responsible in any way for legislation or regulations, policies in any avenue in the public arena, you really need to be sure that your level of knowledge is something that you're very comfortable with, that you really do believe you have knowledge about this subject. How motivated are you to achieve the goal or the parts of it and the plan or some of it? In every piece of advocacy, you really should be real clear with yourself again. What is the goal? What is your outcome? And then what is the plan of action to get to that place? So again, how motivated are you to achieve that goal, or parts of it, and the plan, or some of it? As we talk more about advocacy, to really recognize this is a process. It's not one time, okay, we did this, now it's done. So it's kind of like the next aspect on this slide. How committed are you to being persistent? Are you willing to hang in there for days, for months, for years, working on parts of the goal, or some or part of the plan, to achieve what it is that you want? I think anybody that's worked with legislation, for example, you'll recognize that persistence is so important, but also maintaining your focus on what your goal is and what your plan is really very important. And we'll get to that when I talk about some of the aspects next about advocacy. In that regard, how committed are you? My own personal experience, for example, here in Hawaii, for prescriptive authority for psychologists. When I first came to Hawaii, it was in 1989, and immediately became involved with our legislature on attempting to get prescriptive authority for psychologists. We still, in 2019, now have another bill. We still don't have prescriptive authority, but we have been persistent. We have a goal, we have a plan of action, and so it's about, do you really, again, believe in what you're advocating for? And then are you willing to remain persistent? Now, one of the things with psychology, and particularly possibly more so at the national level than if you're working locally on advocacy, is, are you focused primarily through a view that's coming from your area of psychology? So if you're a clinician, is it coming from the practice aspects? One of the things with our discipline in particular is that we have so many different views that we can have. So if you're an educator, if you're a scientist, if what you're engaged in is research on PTSD as opposed to practicing with regard to veterans with PTSD. So are you focused primarily from your view, but then how able are you to incorporate the views of others? People that you are talking with, and we will get into what about the listener, the person, your audience. People may have very, very different views of psychology, including not even knowing what psychology is. So to be very clear with yourself about, are there limits in terms of how you're presenting your advocacy? So now, and then the last point on this particular slide about developing as an advocate is, how open are you to working with those from other disciplines? And I think if you've been lately, more so lately, on the AVAPL website, you'll see that there have been some documents, particularly those that Dr. Russell Lemley has been very actively involved in developing, where other disciplines have signed on to statements that, or position papers that psychology through AVAPL has put forward, social work, for example. So the question again is, how open are you to working with those from other disciplines? How open are you to being part of what are called coalitions, oftentimes in the political arena? So to really think about yourself more broadly than the affiliation that you have as a psychologist. However, you never ever want to lose sight of that as your primary focus. Generally, overall, you are a psychologist. So let me go back in terms of advocacy, kind of more generally. So, I do think that we need to say, yes, it's a learned behavior. Not everybody just starts right away and can just go right out and start doing advocacy. However, um, when you think about advocacy, more so than in the political arena, but really to think about it as what you're doing is educating. You're educating policymakers, you're educating those who implement rules and regulations. You're educating them about the value of our discipline, but more so because of that value, that our discipline has either a need or a right for the support, for resources, for recognition, for status, for something that is important in order to achieving what the overall goal or objective is. So for example, for we as members in the VA system, I mean, we're really looking at veterans, their families, the communities in which they live. So we have these overall objectives. So going back to, we really are educating. We know how to do that. We're psychologists, we know how to educate. So, but advocacy as a learned behavior, it really does take some experience. So you need to kind of put your toe in the water, get started somewhere, accompany somebody who's been doing some sorts of advocacy over time, and that you can kind of just tag along, use that person as your mentor with regard to advocacy. So you need experience and you need practice to really feel that you feel like you've learned how to do advocacy, that you feel comfortable doing this. You need to remember that you have the existing skills as a psychologist. Everything that we've done in our graduate training can be supporting us if you're doing advocacy. We know about social interactions, we know about perception, we know about motivation, we know about problem solving, decision making. I mean, all of these pieces of our graduate training can really support you when you're looking at how to be a good advocate. So now moving into the role as an advocate, to be really sure that you're carrying a message. And the important parts about that message are that you have clarity in that message, that it's consistent, that you understand the context in which you're going to deliver that message, and that you personally have credibility in delivering that message. So the aspects of the message that we're going to be looking at, again, looking at how do you define the message, clarity. Going back to what I had said earlier with regard to the development of an advocate, that you have some knowledge about the issue. So beyond that, if you're trying to convey your knowledge to somebody who has a role in policy making or implementing regulations, you need to be very sure that the way that you kind of encapsulate that message is that it's clear, data-based, and well presented. Now, while those are the case, one of the things that you'll find, for example, if you're doing advocacy in Washington, D.C., in your congressional offices, many times the staff or even the legislator, they don't necessarily want the data. They have somebody that's going to collect the data for them. What they want is a clear message for them about how is this going to impact their constituents. And it will be the same thing when we go back to what are the parallels for you in your system? What is it about the message that, even though you need to be clear about what your message is, data based in terms of there's factual information to back up why this would be important, and that it's well presented. Consistency. So again, as I mentioned earlier, you need an identified goal and a plan of action, and then you need to stay with that. But one of the things that we're going to talk about also with regard to the message was what I had said earlier, that how persistent are you willing to be? So the persistence may take you through days, weeks, months, years in terms of the same message. The critical thing in all of that is, yes, advocacy is a process. You're looking toward an outcome. In order to get through that process to that outcome, it is so important that you maintain your vision of what the goal is and that you have a plan of action. You may need to make some adjustments in that plan to the particulars of that plan, but not necessarily to the overall pattern. You have a pattern in terms of in general, what you as a psychologist want to do to take the action. You're not going to do things that somebody who would be, let's say, possibly a corporate sponsor that's trying to do something. Their plan of action is going to have a pattern that's very different than you as a psychologist. You're coming from a human behavior perspective, a healthcare perspective, many times, very different. So you need to understand there's a pattern to your plan. The particulars, yes, they may change. The context, now the context can be very specific, or it could be the things that are ongoing in the process of your day-to-day work. So as you're carrying a message, if it's specific, so again, if we kind of shift a little bit, let's say, again, you're going to a legislature, either at your local level or up in DC. Very specific. You're in a one-on-one conversation, or you're talking to a staff person, or in your facility, let's say you need to go to the ACOS to present something that you think psychology should be doing in your program. So it could be specific. On the other hand, your ongoing work, if you know what your goal is, and if you have a sense of what the plan of action, the pattern for that plan of action is, everything that you're doing in your day-to-day work could be part of the ongoing context where you carry that message. Credibility, without a doubt, relationships are critical. And if you ever work with, Heather Kelly, for example, and you go to Washington, absolutely, you will see the value of a relationship. And for you personally, again, individuals who take on public office are individuals. And so you can have personal relationships with them. You can have relationships that are professional relationships with them. So, but the relationship part is critical. They need to see you as honest and trustworthy. They need to see that even though they are presented with people with competing interests, that your interest in being with them is very genuine. So it's very important that you establish credibility. And again, in your everyday work, again, I can remember when I first started with the VA, and it was even before I started, and I attended a meeting of the VA psychologist at an APA convention, and one of the messages that kept coming across was, if you just do good things will happen for psychology. So it may not be if you only do good things that you can achieve an outcome, but doing the good things and establishing your credibility in that system is critical. Who is your listener? Another part of being a really effective advocate is kind of the basic premise of psychotherapy. So I was trained with a student of Carl Rogers, and so in the Rogerian way, it's always to start where your patient is, and it's definitely that the same applies here. Whoever your listener is, you need to understand as a psychologist, that's what we're about, understanding the person that we're with, where are they starting? So some of the real basic things here is, what does that person even know about psychology? Or worse yet, what are their preconceived notions about psychologists? It may be a little bit less now, but I think many times it's still the case that as a psychologist, people who haven't had some kind of focus on mental health issues, on behavioral health issues, something maybe with their own family or constituents, they really do not know that psychologists are not therapists only, that whatever a therapist may be for them, are not psychiatrists, are not junior psychiatrists. So you may be starting with somebody who has very different idea about what a psychologist is. I know for us, many times, those of us working with prescriptive authority, we had to counter in the very beginning the fact that legislators were being told we had high school education. So again, the preconceived notions, how do you get that message across to your listener about what a psychologist is and does? What does the listener know about the issue? And or what does that person believe about the issue? many times, again, if you're working at a legislative area, let's say either state, local, national kinds of things, most of the legislatures have their own web pages. They put out there, if they haven't already mailed it to you personally as a constituent, the areas that are really, really critical for them in terms of what they want to make their mark, where they want to make their mark in Congress. So, for example, I know one of our legislators, our senators, one of the really important things for him is environment. So, even though we talk with him about psychology issues, we also know that what's happening with him in terms of his advocacy for environmental issues is very important. And that's going to carry down to the staff as well. So, does the listener value in a positive way something about the issue? If you can find any opening, it's really going to be important that you think about using that opening to establish a relationship again on that level of knowledge and belief about the issue. Does the listener believe that psychology has something of worth to add? Where does psychology and or your work fit into the priorities of that individual? So again, let's say for the person that I mentioned, environment may be his highest priority, but that doesn't mean that mental health is way down the line. It could be second. But again, looking at what they've talked about, what ends up in print in your newspapers when that person speaks or attends something, what's on the website, definitely ways to understand what their priorities are. What's needed to make a connection with the listener, going back to you as a good psychologist, you're relating to that person in every discussion. What do you need from that listener? So it's not always what you're going to take, but what do you need? So some or part of your goal, how is your plan going to be implemented? Can the advocacy with this listener lead to something that's mutually beneficial? That's the ideal. I mean, you really want to, in a political system, it's about the body politic. I mean, it's about we are they. And so, what can be a win win for everybody? Okay, so now applying advocacy to your position in the VA. Let's return to the development of an advocate, what I had talked about here. It's not any different for you. Do you believe in what you're advocating for? Are you passionate about it? You know, I just saw something that Gail put out about sleep, you know, and some really good things came out in that email I just got about, you know, what psychologist involvement in like CBT for insomnia? Do you believe in that? You know, or are you more likely to say to your patient, yeah, go ahead, take your sleep medications and we'll see if that works or not? So if you believe in what you're advocating for, then you're also going to acquire the level of knowledge about that issue that's going to allow you to be the effective advocate. How motivated are you to achieve the goal or parts of it? Well, in that case, is your goal to improve how the veteran with PTSD is able to function in day to day life because there's something that psychology can do to improve their sleep? Well, then, if you're motivated to do that, then you want to be sure. Let's say that you haven't been able to convince your ACOS that this is a program that you should have resources assigned to. You know, you're assigned to a program, your function and your duties are XYZ. So, how are you going to convince that person that you're motivated to achieve the goal that is part of a broader plan to improve the health and well being, the interaction with family, the participation in community by something which seems so simple as adding resources so a person can now devote time to do CBT for insomnia? So, again, how motivated are you in your site to take on the things that you really believe psychologists can make a definite contribution? How committed are you to being persistent? So, now being persistent without being a nuisance is going to be obviously very important. So there may be different parts of the plan that will allow you to be persistent and you'll work toward it. Again, are you focused on your view as a clinician or are you a researcher, a scientist? somebody who works directly with science as a researcher in the VA system, where is your focus coming from? Because that, again, is going to be part of the plan, and who you're going to talk with in this system. So are you able to incorporate the views of other areas? How open are you to working with those from other disciplines? So what about working with nursing on that? Nursing many times is going to be the first avenue that a patient, when they sit down and they get their vitals taken and they ask the overall questions, many times it's somebody from nursing staff that's going to be doing that. How open are you to working with those from other disciplines to really achieve what you see as your objective? Okay, so again, converting all of this to your VA workplace, let's return to the message that was defined. So we're looking at clarity, consistency, the context, and credibility. And again, I know that we're going to be really close to the ending time. So I suppose maybe focusing really on credibility is going to be one of the primary things that you want to do. These other things are going to be there. You'll put them into place. The credibility is maybe something that you're going to need to work on in a very different way. Particularly, I mean, if let's say you need to go to the ACLS or you need to go to somebody in the director's office to get something done, and that person has no idea who you are, then how are you going to establish that part of the credibility? Again, returning to who the listener is. So all of these aspects that we just talked about, starting where your listener is starting from, all of these things are going to be really important to implement. So I know we only have a few minutes left, and I do want to get into the questions. So Tiffany, how do you want to do the questions? Open mic, or do you want me
I
to just go
think,
toward um,
yeah,
the
there are some written
if there were written
questions,
questions?
and I can go back through the chat box and find them. I think there's one from Julio Rosado here. Um, and the question is, can a government employee call their representatives and say they support or do not support bills?
So now, again, if you're not doing that on your work time and you're not in your workplace, yes, you can do that. However, what I would caution you about is there's another layer to this, which is many times in directly approaching a congressional person, your media people, your communications person, probably has a way of interacting with people at the congressional level. They should be at least informed that you're going to be in contact with that person. But again, when you do that, you cannot be doing that as in applying in some way that it is in your role as whatever your position happens to be in the VA system. So yes, you can do that, but again, all of those caveats still are in place. And as a courtesy, it would really be important to talk with your communications person to let them know. There cannot be, because of the Hatch Act, an infringement on your First Amendment rights to address political things. But you also don't want to do anything that's going to end up having a black mark within your system as somebody that's not part of the overall mission of your facility.
Thanks, Kathy. I think
Were there
that's
other
the only
questions,
one I think I
Tiffany, in the
saw.
chat
I just
box?
wanted to also highlight that Chris Loftus during the presentation had sent me some files pertaining to the Hatch Act, the memo, and also social media information. So those were uploaded into the files pod right above this chat box. So if you're interested in downloading those are also in the files pod for download. Um, and
Okay.
any other? Oh,
And I think they may have been added before, because when
mhm.
Heather and I did something for Division 18, I think that we also tried to upload some
Oh, good.
things
Okay.
on the website about the Hatch Act, for example. But thank you, Chris, for letting people know that
I
those
see
things are there
somebody is
too.
typing a question now too, so can pause for. Kathy, as you were
Okay.
speaking, and I what struck me is, kind of thinking about outside of I guess, my own perspective, because personally I get so, siloed in my little world or my way of thinking or from my point of view, and I forget about, expanding and thinking, considering who else might be impacted or other points of view, even other disciplines like nursing, social work, for instance. And so that was a real aha for me that I'm going to take away from that.
Uh-huh. Yeah. One of my very early lessons was when I first joined the VA, I'd actually come from a university position and it was a professional school. So we were very pro psychology and very proactive about many, many things for psychology. And when I first got there, I looked at the bylaws for my facility, and the bylaws had psychologists behind lab technicians in
Hmm.
terms of where we would stand, if at all, in bylaws. And when I went to the a director, I ended up at the director because our chief of psychology at the time said, you need to work on this if it matters to you, which it did. But when I went there, what he told me was that, well, when nursing and social work are opposed to psychology being part of of the bylaws. So it took me 2 years, but it also took me time of developing relationships with nursing and social work chiefs at the time, even though I was only an early career staff person, so to speak, not early career in terms of my professional career, but in terms of the VA.
Mm.
So, a lesson learned very early on about like why would nursing and social work object to psychologists being in the bylaws? And obviously a good part of that was status. So
I do.
okay,
Yeah,
so
there's
was
one
there
from
another
Genevieve
question there?
Davis.
Let's see in the
Do
chat
you
bar.
have any tips for elevating status or recognition either within your hospital or with other groups you may be advocating to or with? For instance, if you're working with associate chief of staff and they have no idea who
You know,
you are, have you found anything to be helpful to enhance that relationship?
yeah, and again, the really important foundation for that is that they know you. So somehow you have to become more visible to them. Now, that may not be visible, you, the person, like, presenting yourself as an individual in their office, but really one of the really important things is to be outside of your area. So let's say if you're in mental health or you're in primary care, to be outside of that. Your VA system is a system that has so many parts. You have things like your root cause analysis situations. You have, the overall ethics committees. You have other kinds of committees that work on projects. The more that you can be in positions that are outside of what your one-to-one day-to-day work is about, the more you make contributions. And that's one of the really great things about psychologists. We have such a breadth of knowledge and skills that we can fit into so many different places. So the more that you can be in your system outside of where um, your direct line of authority might be, the more that you can contribute to the overall mission of your organization, then the more likely it is that you can become more visible. And you will be able, the more visible you are, the more contributions you make. Volunteer to write the reports. If it's the committee needs a report that goes forward to somebody, or volunteer to be one of the people who writes the report so that your name ends up being attached to it. You need to be visible in ways that you contribute outside of where your employment per se may be. So I hope that helps, Genevieve. So thank you too for
See, we have
participating
about,
today.
yeah. Yes, I see a question now
And then
coming in
Tiffany,
from
did you say there was
Travis.
another?
Travis asks, how is advocacy for bills or issues on authorized absence for professional
Okay.
conferences viewed? Is this off duty?
Yes. So if you have authorized absence, so now, if you're going to actually be, if you're going to be doing quote lobbying, it can't just be authorized absence. I mean, you'd have to take vacation days. Now, authorized absence, if you're advocating, which is educating somebody, then that could occur if your facility is amenable to that. So obviously from one facility to another, it could be very different. So, but it could be authorized absence as long as what you're doing is not considered, quote, lobbying. So, the political activity, for example, that you're doing. But if you're talking with somebody, and again, I'm thinking a situation where I had a call from APA, they needed somebody to come and testify in Washington about something. I called my director to let him know this was short notice. Some of the veterans, I may need to change their appointments. They may get upset about this. And what he told me was, you're the voice of the veteran. I need you to go and testify on behalf of the veterans. So if you have a facility like that, obviously then authorized absence would be important because you're seen, and that goes back, I think, to Genevieve's question about how are you seen in your
Thanks,
facility?
Kathy. And
Yeah, so I know
yeah,
we only have a couple minutes and there's another 10 o'clock,
yeah.
or, well,
So
for
really
me, 10
quickly,
o'clock,
let
so
me
3
wrap
o'clock call,
this.
I guess.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And Kathy,
So thank you
I
all
was going to
very
say thank you
much.
so much. I'll just wrap up and
Yeah, go
just
ahead, Kathleen.
quickly talk about
Yeah.
logistics. I know some of you may be attending and claiming continuing education credit as a result of your participation on today's webinar, and you can do that by by completing an online evaluation. There's a link in the notes pod, but I just put it, or Howie just put it, linked it in the chat box for you. But you can take this brief program evaluation. In there, you can, if you're claiming continuing education, you can fill it in with your name and email address, and also indicate if you're a member of either Division 18 or AVAPAL. Of course, members of those organizations can claim continuing education for free. It's $15 for non-members. If you're not a member of either organization and you don't want to claim CE, that's fine. You don't have to. But please complete the evaluation by next Thursday, March 7th, and then you'll receive your continuing education certificate by email in about 2 to 3 weeks. And I'll also follow up with an email with all of these instructions too, because I know I'm talking quickly. But before we go, I just want to give a quick plug for next week's VA section webinar on March 7th. So another highly regarded psychologist, Dr. Rodney Baker, will be here, and he's going to describe the rich history of VA psychology and VA psychology training in the early years. And of course, the many contributions psychology has made to the treatment programs and clinical services for veterans. And so if you're interested in attending, there's an advertisement flyer for this webinar in the files pod. So you can, register through that link. So we hope to see you again next week. And for any follow-up questions, feel free to contact me. Thanks so much for attending today. Kathy, thank you so much for your time. Great information. Right.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you. Thank
Aloha.
you. So aloha to
Bye.
everyone.